Back in 2021, I had the opportunity to run the Seattle Marathon, and you're running along and you come about mile 20 or so onto the campus at the University of Washington, and I looked up and I saw this. It's like, oh my goodness, that's Mount Rainier. Most beautiful thing I've ever seen in a marathon. So I stopped in the middle of the race. I said, I got to take a picture. I took a selfie. It looked like this. Very, very, very disappointing. The mountain is right here, back in the background, but you can't tell. I could take this picture and zoom in, and it kind of looks like there's a mountain there, but this is just not good. This is a problem with the very nature of cameras. We need to do something to make this look like that. Let's talk about it. Computational imaging. Episode 67, Dynamic Range. Back in episode 59, we discussed the camera equation relating the irradiance illuminating an object to the irradiance that we have on the focal plane observing the object. A rho here is the reflectivity, and the F number is the F number. So if rho was like 0.2 and the F number was somewhere around 2, then we would have a irradiance on the image plane that might be an order of magnitude or less of the illuminating irradiance, but still, roughly of the same order of magnitude. The challenge we have in photography is that the illuminating irradiance has a very, very large range. Here's a table from Wikipedia. There's orders of magnitude of the illuminance of objects for different scenes. So if you have direct solar illumination, you're typically going to have somewhere in here, a photographic scene illuminated in full sunlight, which would be 10 to the third candles per meter squared, compared to the minimum threshold would be 10 to the minus 5. So you have about 10 to the 8th range of illumination, about 10 to the 8th. And of course, then you can go to much brighter scenes that are like looking directly at lamps or looking directly at the sun. The unit here is the candela. The candela is a lumen per steradian. The lumen is the SI unit of photopic response, so it's weighted by the human visual response with a peak at 555 nanometers, so it's a spectrally weighted response used for illumination systems. So the candela is a lumen per steradian, the lux is a lumen per meter squared. And again, so for a sunny day, you're illuminated by 10 to the 5th lux. And on a starry night, you have 10 to the minus 3 lux. So we have this range of, let's say, 8 orders of magnitude of illumination that we might want to take photographic images with. We think about what this means for the number of photons available for a camera looking at these various scenes. The key point here is to look over on the right column, where you see that the number of photons per pixel, basically per micron squared, is large. So it's a billion even in fairly dark scenes. Now, of course, if we measure at a 30th of a second, then we have f3 or f2, and then we have a color filter that will cut our efficiency. We get down to maybe a million or fewer photons available. This is still a large number compared to the number of photons that's typically detected on current focal plane arrays. Here's a figure that we've seen in several of the previous episodes about the well capacity of different focal plane arrays based on the pixel size. Well capacity is determined by the detector geometry and the capacitance, which is proportional to the pixel size. And typically it's going to range from 10,000 up to 100,000 or even up to a million. When you digitize, so you're going to read out this charge off of the detector and digitize it. When you digitize it, of course, you'd like to accurately reflect the signal. But if you digitize with too many bits, then you're just digitizing noise. So with 10,000 photons, the noise level would typically be around 100 photons. If you think about sort of having the least significant bit representing some fraction of 100 photons, 8 bits is plenty of dynamic range to cover 10,000 photons. If we go up to a million photons, we might want up to 10 or 12 bits, but that's where typical focal planes are going to be, something that digitizes the signal with between 8 and 12 bits. And that's plenty to describe what you get out of a focal plane. Unfortunately, it's not nearly enough to describe the dynamic range that we'd see in a scene, ranging, as we said, from looking at something that's solar illuminated to something that might be in the shadows. We might have 8 orders of magnitude of dynamic range in the illumination of a scene, which would require us to have 28 or 30 bits to fully describe that. Now, of course, we don't really need that kind of digitization for each bit. If something's very bright, we would digitize that individual pixel at 8 bits, but at its signal level. So this kind of continuous mapping of the signal onto discrete levels that are evenly spaced is not appropriate for most scenes, but is the reality of how cameras actually work. And then one of the very unfortunate things in cameras is that the exposure time is set by not saturating too much of the maximum brightness. And so in this episode 66, we talked about different exposure strategies, but the important thing to recognize in this diagram is not the difference between rolling shutter and global shutter. It's that this exposure time, the blue time, is typically set to set the exposure levels where you're not overly saturating the sensor for most of the range, but then the digitized values of the signal are evenly spaced over the range of the well capacity of the pixel. And so once you've got to a range where you're not saturating, you're going to stop exposing for the rest of the frame time, and so most of the pixels are going to be lost. So the actual quantum efficiency of most sensors is poor, because the exposure time is typically much less than the frame time. This is a very unfortunate aspect of the current design of cameras. Event cameras are one solution to this, but they're maybe too focused on processing individual pixels. There are much more innovative ways to imagine exposure control, but they're not implemented in current sensors, so we need to deal with that as we think about how to manage images taken with real sensors. Here's an example of an image taken out of my office at the University of Arizona. And this image is analyzed in the GitHub site on the notebook linked here. And so one of the things we can look at when we see a scene like this is the histogram. So looking at the histogram is a way to tell how efficiently we're using the dynamic range in a scene. And so OpenCV has a call we can use to look at the histogram of the red, green, and blue channels as shown here. Since the foreground of this image is dark and the background is light, there are a lot of pixel values out here in the light area, but most of the pixels in the scene are underexposed. And what you see here is that the pixel values, when we look at the histogram of an actual raw image, they're going to be digitized over 8 bits, and so they're evenly separated over this range from 0 to 255. Now, if we want to improve how this scene looks, one thing we could do is say, well, let's take these values that are low and increase their how we display them. So in the problem we have in computational imaging, always we're interested in how do we capture data, and then later, how do we display data. So as we compute on the data, we don't have to display it over the linear range that we captured it on. And one way to adjust the tone in this image is to do a gamma correction. So gamma correction takes each pixel value and represents it by a new value. So basically, we have the input signal values and the displayed signal values don't have to be the same. So this is a map of the input signal value over the range from 0 to 1 to the output signal value. This idea of exponential boosts in the pixel values actually dates back to film photography, when based on the gain or the grain size of film, you could get different effective gammas. And so we can take the image that we started with here, the kind of image looking out the window where the things in the office are dark and the things outside in the sunlight are much brighter. And now if we use a small value of gamma, we will brighten the dark parts relative to the bright parts. And so you see this map now, the things inside the office are more visible. And as we increase gamma, we can also boost the bright parts relative to the dark parts, as shown here. So this is one way, this process of adjusting the effective signal values to improve the dynamic range as perceived in the image is called tone mapping. Another kind of tone mapping would be logarithmic tone mapping, where again we just have a function relating the measured signal values to the displayed signal values and making that nonlinear. Here's examples of this logarithmic tone mapping to adjust the image. Now, the humans, as you look at a scene, I was able to see Mount Rainier at the same time as I could see the fountain at the University of Washington, because my eyes don't use the same tone map everywhere in the scene. So, you can have a differential tone map in different parts of the scene that allow you to see bright parts. So, when I'm in my office looking out the window, obviously I can see things in the window and I can see things outside the window at the same time, which is not represented in this scene. One way to manage this would be to have a local tone map. For example, we can create masks. Here's masks that are thresholded in the red, green, and blue channels for this image, where we say, well, we'll use a different gamma or a different tone map for what's outside and what's inside, and just boost the signal values inside. And so you can do then things like this. So we've now taken a mask where we use one gain for the outside part of the scene and another gain for the inside part of the scene. And we have something that will seem more natural to a way a human would actually perceive this scene. Now, of course, that's a very simple sort of algorithm for doing tone mapping. There are much more sophisticated types of algorithms. One thing you can do is, of course, create an image where you have multiple exposures. We'll talk about in a second, which would allow us to have different levels of noise in different parts of the scene. But then once we have the image, we can go through a sequence of algorithmic steps that would process the image so as to create a local tone map in an intelligent sort of way. And of course, there's many papers and many algorithms are out there about this. And here's a review article from several years ago that you could go look at and look at the diversity of different kinds of local and global tone mapping strategies, and things that look at static parts of the scenes and things that work over video sequences. Several of these algorithms are built into OpenCV. So here's the Reinhardt algorithm and the Mantuik algorithm. The Mantuik algorithm uses a Gaussian pyramid to do like a multi-scale kind of a tone map. The Reinhardt is a more global sort of tone map, and you can compare that with the mask tone map and the original, and see that you're able to display the image. Of course, this is taking data. The real problem with this, of course, is that the dark parts of the scene are underexposed. We don't have enough signal to noise there, so we need to come up with a better strategy. But definitely, as we get the data, there's no reason for us to display the data with a strictly linear map from the signal value to the display. So we have these two problems of how do we represent the scene accurately, and then how do we display the data in a way that will seem natural. Of course, deep learning has been applied to this, and so here's a paper from 2020 on tone mapping strategies. But of course, everything in deep learning is very dynamic. So if you go and look in the literature, you'll find a number of deep tone mapping strategies that will improve on these results. Now, so this is all on the display side, but we would like to have better data. So one way to recognize the fact that the scene has this very high dynamic range is to make multiple exposures. Now, one approach might be just to make a lot of fast exposures, and then find a way to map the video sequence with fast exposures onto a good display. And my personal feeling is that that's the long-term strategy, is to have dynamic exposure control and then create the display from process over a sequence of frames. But just as a simple introduction here, we should focus on the process that's now highly developed in the computer vision community for creating multiframe HDR. So you expose a frame at several different levels that would get different parts of the scene within appropriate exposure. The problem you have now is that you need to figure out how to relate those exposure levels from different scenes to each other, and then align the images and merge them. Returning to the scene, looking out the office window, on the left we see exposure at 250 microseconds, and then an order of magnitude longer exposure in the middle, and an order of magnitude again longer exposure on the right. Now, OpenCV has tools that we can use to algorithmically combine these images. The first thing you need to do is come up with a model for how the signal values relate to these different exposure times. And so you can get a camera response as a function of calibrated intensity, and use that to try to map the relative values of the different images onto a scale that we could use to combine them. And then, of course, you use the same kind of multi-image fusion strategies that we've talked about with panoramic stitching to align the images and combine them. Here the images are, the object is not very far away, so yeah, using homography to combine the image from this background and this near point is kind of a challenge. And so this is something where a neural processor might do a whole lot better. But this is, part of the idea of really the solution to this problem over time is to find ways to get multi-exposure images. Now, of course, today you can buy focal planes that could do raster scans of different exposure levels in different rows of the image that will help a lot with HDR, but that only gives you two different exposure values, and really to get this kind of 8-order magnitude dynamic range, more sophisticated strategies. It's amazing, of course, across computational photography, how very bad cameras are compared to the human eye still, and so we have a major opportunity here to really rethink the way that data is processed from temporal sequences to create images and dynamic range, and there's remains a big opportunity here, I think, to make images much better. It uses dynamic control of the exposure and then processing of sequences, which is also what we're going to talk about next time when we talk about how to manage focus. So throughout chapter 10, we're mostly interested in how to make samples and create images. This is an example. The red square here is a region of interest where we're going to focus, and this is a dynamic control system for setting focus. The center image here is a sequence of frames that are captured by the system, and what you'll notice is that different parts of the scene are in focus and out of focus in different ones of those frames, and then the lower right is a all-in-focus image that's created from that sequence of frames. And if you look at the image on the lower right, the first frame is out of focus, but subsequent frames are all in focus because this is data that's synthesized. And so we're going to think about focus control not as a process where we set the camera to a best focus, but where dynamically we control focus to get the data that we want, which is the core challenge of computational imaging.